I want to mention for today's talk is something interesting because some of you might be asking, well, what does Bitcoin have anything to do with psychedelics? And it'd be a good question. And it was something that took a little bit of time for me to come to understand, as well as with Peter. Peter's a longtime friend of mine, and he's been part of the Meetup since day one. But he's had a chance to communicate to me and help me understand sort of what the connection, what the parallels are. And you go from seeing it as more of just a sort of speculative online digital token that may or may not make you or lose you a lot of money, to something that actually fundamentally changes the way we interact with each other as being a perfect store of value. So again, the details, I'll leave that to Peter. But I did just want to go through a couple of things real quick. Is to understand Bitcoin, you first have to understand what money is. And money is essentially a store of value. So it's a way that you can store sort of the fruits of your labor and your goods into an exchange medium where you can hold it and then redeem it for someone else's fruits, the fruits of their labor in a sense. And it's important to understand that money itself is not value. Money is a pointer to value. So a $10 bill points to a certain amount. Sorry, you guys cannot hear me in the back? Any better there? Can you hear me? Okay. So money itself is not value. It is a pointer to value. So a $10 bill points to $10 in value, as a $100 bill points to $100 in value, and they'll both make the same polymer. So it's not the bill itself that's a value, it's the value that it points to. Now, if we look at value, and we understand that value itself is something that, in a sense, exists in consciousness. It cannot exist outside of consciousness. So much in the way that this table over here might be value because you can sit down on it. And but if I were to say, pay Peter $100 to jump over this table, this table is actually an impediment to him, and it would be a negative value. So in a sense, it's an ability for us to store what is in some ways a subjective store of value. So and essentially what I want to get to, this is one last point I'll make over here, which is that if you look at some of the problems with our financial system today and the way things work with money, is that we live in a world where central banks by central governments can essentially print money. And what this does is you can expand the monetary supply. So this is all the bills that exist. And by being able to expand this, you don't actually expand the value, that is all the goods or service that exists. You're expanding the monetary supply. So like if a government, for example, decides to, let's just use an extreme example, if they decide to double the monetary value, so if they double the supply of currency, they don't actually double the value. So what they did is they just diluted the value that you have. It's like a stock split, but they keep the extra stock. And this is the sort of slow rate inflation that essentially ends up stealing. So if you have $100,000 in savings, after that it's only worth $50,000. So this is sort of where the Bitcoin proposition comes in, being something that is in a sense like a perfect gold, that is like a perfectly decentralized, and it is not owned by any central government, or it is not owned by any central authority. As well, it is perfectly scarce in the sense that once you reach 21 million Bitcoin, it cannot be exceeded. So that's sort of the short of it. It's a very summed up version of what the value proposition is there. I'll actually leave it to Peter to kind of get into the details and specifically how it relates to psychedelics, because there are some very important and very fascinating parallels there. So with that, I'll pass it to Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christoph. I'm glad to be here today. You basically explained everything. I don't even have to say anything anymore. No, but seriously speaking, I'm going to be using my iPad here just for some notes, just so I don't get off track. So I might be glancing over briefly, but just give me one moment, please. And the base, there we go. Okay, so the topic is psychedelics, Bitcoin, and the future of decentralization. The mushroom is to the human as Bitcoin is to humanity. So we could talk for hours about mushrooms. We could talk for hours about Bitcoin and economic theory. But what actually connects these two things in such a way that I'm up here today talking about this? And that idea is decentralization. So Christoph talked about that briefly, but I want to dive deeper into decentralization and explain to you how this is a phenomenon that can actually change our culture from the bottom up, much like the same way we're all here for psychedelics, and how we felt profound benefits and changes in our personal well-being from adopting or being interested in or being part of these communities that we've formed. So I guess Christoph kind of explained briefly what Bitcoin is. To sum it up, it's magical internet money, right? It's just an empty store of value. It has no other real purpose other than for us to take our energy and to store it, much like money does. And then I'm sure most of you know what mushrooms are. Whether you've eaten them in your risotto or if you've had a mystical experience on a little tea that you drank the other day, all of us are familiar with them. But there's kind of two components to the mushroom. So we have the fruiting body, but we also have sort of this mycelial network, which is the decentralized intelligence processing, the intelligent processing system, the information processing system underneath the mushroom that allows not only the mushroom is just the reproducing portion of it, but the mycelial network is the layer that not only allows the mushroom to flourish, but it allows the forest to flourish. And that forest is, we can think of it like that forest represents us. We're that ecosystem that can flourish from adopting a new reality, a new system. So I want to lay out 4 principles that I'm going to be touching on throughout this topic. And basically, I'm going to be using the power of analogy to paint a picture for you how Bitcoin can elicit the same type of entropic states in culture as psychedelics do to the individual. So first, whenever I talk about mushrooms, I'm talking about psychedelic mushrooms and also the decentralizing layer of the mycelial network. And I'm comparing that to the human being and their effect primarily on the centralized system, which is the ego. So mushrooms, human, Bitcoin is the mushroom in this case, and it has the fruiting body, which is basically the price signal. It's like the token. And then the decentralized layer is the blockchain. And I'll be explaining all of this in more detail. So we have then Bitcoin and then culture and human culture. What does the mushroom do to the human as Bitcoin does to humanity? Okay, so essentially, when we think about what psychedelics do, particularly mushrooms, we can explain mushrooms on a physical level, right? They are the primary organisms that they break down nutrients in the forest floor that allows the forest to thrive. But the decentralized information processing network that they use is actually a system that's apparent in all of nature and has sort of this resilience. If you were to destroy one part of the network, then another part of the network is there to take its place and to grow stronger. So we can see these decentralized systems throughout nature, and they've been quite successful. We can see it in the internet. We can see it in dark matter. We can see it in neural networks in our own mind. And even when we try to recreate artificial intelligence, we build it using sort of this decentralized information processing system. And so on a physical level, we see that, okay, mushrooms have this mycelial network, but then on an informational level, that psychedelic experience, when we take the mushroom, the primary understanding we have of what psychedelics do to the individual, the thing that a lot of research papers talk about is their effect on the default mode network. And the default mode network, if you guys aren't familiar, is this idea that we have a group of brain networks that are responsible for creating our identity and our ego. And when we take the psychedelic, it actually comes into our bloodstream and it reduces the blood flow into the default mode network. And that's part of the reasons why we have these experiences, so-called ego dissolution, less blood flow to the brain networks that are responsible for creating this interface between you and reality, your ego. And so when you think about it, the actual physical embodiment of the mushroom, the mycelial network, is actually taking its place. It's allowing your own mind to decentralize. So you're actually becoming more like the mushroom. And I know this kind of sounds radical, but this is exactly what Bitcoin has the potential to do to humanity. And the reason this could be what saves us from ourselves, much like sometimes we've hit rock bottom, and it took a psychedelic trip to make us not only realize that we've hit rock bottom, to maybe start taking the steps towards trying to fix things. And what I'm trying to say here is the current monetary system that we have is rock bottom. And so if we transition and we see, okay, this psychedelic experience is essentially a decentralizing, a lessening of the ego, and allowing you to get more into chaos, and not in this unhealthy way, but kind of just relaxing a little bit and being able to integrate back into your natural self. We see that we have this solution that's offered to us in the form of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin also, the history of it, it's kind of like a mushroom. It appeared out of nowhere. Satoshi Nakamoto, the guy who created it, whether it's a one person or a group of people, the pseudonym, it's just a mystery. Nobody knows who he is. We don't really know how mushrooms evolved, but they came here to be, and they've been around for millennia, billions of years. And so out comes Bitcoin in the midst of the economic crisis of 2008, its birth. And over time, it's just under the radar, just like psychedelics are under the radar of Western culture. And in the 50s, Gordon Wasson goes and finds, Richard Evans Schultes finds the mushrooms, and then he brings them over. And then, it kind of explodes. Timothy Leary becomes this proponent, and we have all these sort of crazy celebrity figures that are promoting the use of psychedelics. And whether or not that was a great experiment in the 60s, we're here today in a new psychedelic renaissance. And so we're about to see potentially an economic renaissance with this new form of money that is emerging, not only in Bitcoin, but in cryptocurrency. And maybe at the end, I'll explain why Bitcoin is the best. So, so basically, I've kind of explained, I've laid the groundwork that essentially on a physical level, we can translate the physical properties of the mycelial network into how it affects the informational properties of your ego. And so Christoph kind of alluded to this idea. We have this central bank. The central bank and the governments associated with the central bank, because the central bank essentially owns government, is the ego of culture. Our culture is dictated by these representatives. Just like our ego, and our ego is responsible for our human body. The government is responsible for the human bodies. And the problem is when the ego runs amok, it doesn't actually work in the body's favor. It can do all sorts of damage to the body, and the body, over time, it might grow so accustomed to this low quality of life, it doesn't even become apparent that there's a problem in the first place. So Christoph brought up this idea of inflation, right? That effectively, when a government prints more money than they need to, they have this toxic relationship with printing money. It dilutes the money supply, and they're effectively stealing money from your pocket. You had $100, the value of your $100 becomes the value of what $50 is, because they've doubled the money supply. And in the past year alone, I think the United States government itself printed more than 30% of all money printed ever in 1 year. So whether or not the effects of that inflation are going to happen immediately is yet to be the case. But we're slowly starting to see, the price of meat and milk and everything rise. So as you can imagine, this is sort of the effects of an ego being irresponsible. And over time, the body eventually will start realizing that things are not going right. So when we introduce Bitcoin into the system, we can take the decentralizing property. So the physical layer of the blockchain, which is this network that establishes consensus. You have different nodes. I could talk for infinite amounts of time about these things in more detail, but I wanted to talk about the analogy and what it can really do for us. So basically, we have the decentralized network, the blockchain, that allows for everybody can basically mine Bitcoin. I mean, nowadays you do need to have a little bit more money up front, but more or less, if one area like China is responsible for a large amount of mining, if one area gets attacked, then out pops another area where there's more opportunity, more cheap energy. And so the network built into it has some sort of resilience. And again, the physical properties of these networks are actually integrated or transition into the informational layer as the cultural level or at the ego level. So the resilience that the mycelial network has is actually something that allows you to have resilience, that allows you to see your inner strength, that allows you to overcome the challenges you have. And in the same way, when we take the benefits that Bitcoin has compared to a monetary system that is subject to inflation, then we actually also adopt on an informational or cultural level the same strengths. So, for example, each one of us, whether we like to believe it or not, whether our relationship with money is positive or negative, money is actually the foundation of our cultural reality. If you go back to the beginning of your existence, your parents, they had to earn money and they had to earn a living to put food on the table for you. You go to school and hopefully because you want to become a productive member of society to be able to provide value and to earn your tokens. And then you exchange those tokens for economic goods and services. And essentially that is your life. Your life is about money. Whether you want to, whether you like it or not, you can escape reality. You can go to, live off grid and enjoy that kind of lifestyle, but it's very difficult. And you'll find out sooner rather than later that you need a big community to be able to support that kind of lifestyle. So this is where we are today. We have, cultural operating system, Western culture, Judeo-Christian Western culture operating system that I'm operating under this. And then we live in this sort of cultural reality where the government has this kind of money. But the problem is that now ourselves, we're subject to a centralized system that is allowed to do whatever they want at their own whim. We don't actually have a real say in the economic policy. The economic policy is dictated by what earns the most profit for the people who are at the top. And we've seen this more times than not. There's going to be two parties, there's a good and there's a bad, and then one side, they're on this side, they're on that side, but at the end, the results are often too similar. There's very few differences between these options that we're given. And so what Bitcoin allows is that in the same way that the psychedelic experience, its primary effect is reduced blood flow to the default mode network. The primary effect of Bitcoin is reduced liquidity, reduced money flow to the central bank. Because now you actually have a system that allows the individual sovereignty. You become your own bank. Your Bitcoin is your Bitcoin. It's non-confiscatable. Nobody else can take it from you. Nobody else can inflate it and create more out of thin air, effectively stealing from you. And so what this does is actually changes the dynamic completely of your existence. Because in the same way that I was saying, like, if the money system, the monetary system is the base layer of your cultural reality, just like how your ego is the base layer of your reality, your individual reality, because if without an ego, we can't operate. If you ever experienced ego death, it's not very colorful. It's kind of empty. And so in that sense, when you have a psychedelic experience, it affects your ego. It fundamentally changes the way you interface with the world because your ego is the base layer of your interface. If money is the base layer of how culture emerges, then if you actually affect money, then you affect culture because the culture foundationally is dependent on how money works, right? And so I wanted to kind of give 3 stories about how things would change as a result of Bitcoin becoming a more integrated monetary system in today's society. And this is kind of the meat of the discussion here. Like, basically, you could talk all sorts of science and everything, but I wanted to make you guys feel intuitively how this makes sense. So first, I want to talk about the healthcare system. So the healthcare system today, you have a doctor that goes out there and they put their life on the line. They want to do the best they can. My mom's a doctor. I could see how much suffering goes on when you put your effort in and your patient doesn't make it, right? And obviously you can pray as much as you want for miracles, but at the end of the day, yeah, science has been great and it's helped us save lives. But also, my mom is within a system that's actually not primarily built to help people. The healthcare system is just like any other system that exists, built on top of the monetary layer that we currently have. Because the monetary system today is inflationary, your money today is worth more than your money tomorrow. So all you're actually incentivized to do, you're not actually incentivized to provide value, because it doesn't matter if you provide value. All that really matters is what can I do to manipulate the system to acquire more tokens, right? How can I take more value? How can I actually acquire more tokens, extract more value? So you actually have the opposite effect. So people inside, they're working their lives away, like these doctors, everybody, and they're just pawns in a larger game, right? In a larger Ponzi scheme, essentially. And if you had Bitcoin or something like Bitcoin, a decentralized network, no one right owner, and that's a deflationary, nobody can willy-nilly steal your money from you. There's no one person in charge of how things are, the monetary policy. There are rules, but there are no rulers. Then what you effectively have is you have an incentive to add value, because you of course want to acquire more tokens, but what's built in as a primary layer of the system now is that if there's a more efficient system, so for example, with the healthcare system right now, it kind of makes more money if people are sick because you can sell the medicine. But the thing is, there's a lot of inefficiencies as a result of keeping people sick. But that doesn't matter because the people who own everything, they just want to make more money. They don't actually care about getting people healthy, because if you got people healthy, now on the grand scheme of things, it would be more efficient and more effective, and the economy would actually be thriving. But the problem would be is that they would be actually having to redistribute some of the wealth that they would be earning back to other people. So if you had something like Bitcoin as the primary monetary policy, the layer, it would become immediately transparent that if the world is operating less efficiently, your money is now worth less. So we'd be incentivized to actually create a world to add more value. So just like how the psychedelic all of a sudden changes, like, oh, I believe in myself, and like, maybe I can, you obviously have to do the work and strive towards something better. In the same way, Bitcoin's not going to magically transform the world, but it gives us the opportunity, like that inflection point, to actually start making changes. It gives us like this exit valve. It's like, right now there's just this big bubble. We're building this big bubble, and it's just like this addiction to this money, but it's fake. And money, at the end of the day, it's just a token. It's a pointer to value, but money is the highest form of energy. Like, this is why we're here. We're here. We've made it this far in civilization. We're able to wear these clothes and have this building over our heads because of money, because of this exchange of economic goods and services that allowed us to thrive. So being able to actually fundamentally change the nature of how we operate with money is going to allow society to thrive. And so that's an example of how the healthcare system would improve immediately. Now, I kind of wanted to pivot to the idea of the drug addict. So the same idea, which is like, okay, the drug addict is going to have some sort of interaction with psychedelic drugs, right? And if you have somebody who has a cocaine habit, you might come up to them and you're like, hey, let's try and give this guy an intervention. But maybe he himself has this dissonance, and they themselves have this dissonance. Oh, like, I know that I should stop doing this drug, but also I really like doing this drug. And so when they're offered this intervention, you have two options. They either take the opportunity or they double down. So a lot of the times, for example, the government is this addict, right now, this drug addict. They're addicted to this toxic money. And so time and time again, they've been given this opportunity to change the system fundamentally from the ground up. But every single time, even with COVID, I was actually like a reality check for society. But when offered this reality check, like, hey, maybe we should change the way things work, instead, they did what the cocaine addict did when offered the intervention. They doubled down and they printed more money. And so what happens in this case is that eventually the cocaine addict is gonna hit rock bottom. Like, you're just gonna do enough drugs, disconnect yourself from all of your friends and family, stop caring about anything else, and eventually you're just not gonna have anything to hang on to. And I mean, either you just break down and it's like kind of a hopeless, unhappy ending, or there's one silver lining. So I do not recommend anybody do this if you know people who are addicted to drugs or anything else. But one way you can stage an intervention for somebody is you accidentally slip some LSD into their water, right? And so what that can do is, it's not going to radically change their life immediately, but it's going to give them that opportunity to step outside of themselves and to see maybe a different potential, right? And now that's exactly what Bitcoin is. So Bitcoin, people get a taste of it, and you kind of like, you're like, oh, number go up, like I make money, cool. And like the thing is, you might get in for the greed, and that's good. Like the price is the signal. Get in for sure, make some money, but you stay for the revolution. Just like you're at a party and you take some mushrooms and you're like, oh man, I stay, I'm getting in for the fun, like let's have an orgy, whatever. And then it's like, and then it so and so, but essentially, you have some of these experiences and you're like, wow, like I'm spiritually transformed. Like this was something more than just a fun drug. This was like something deep. And that's what Bitcoin can do. Like right now we had, El Salvador took a really big step and they became the first country in the history of the world to adopt a new currency. Like that's completely different than anything else. Like this is a huge historic leap. And like, the International Monetary Fund, one of the fingers of the ego comes in and they're like, oh, like, we don't know about this. Like, this isn't environmentally friendly. And they'll kind of say all sorts of fear and they'll try and spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt and to try and limit this, because they know deep down that so the ego knows like, oh, like this is a threat. Like we have all this control, but now this, this little thing, this little intervention got slipped in. And it's kind of growing, and it's like becoming more apparent that it is an exit valve. It is an opportunity to kind of change the nature of the game. So we're going to see, as this emerges as a potential solution to the problems that I've kind of outlined, we're going to see more and more resistance from the ego, from the central governments, potentially banning. We've seen India ban it. We've seen China crack down on Bitcoin mining. There's going to be all sorts of ways that the ego is going to try and convince the body, convince the humanity that this isn't the solution. We'll create a central bank digital currency because that's the way to do it. But that's exactly the problem, because decentralization is the thing that we need. We need to bring in that chaos, right? And now the last story I want to talk about, and I'll kind of hopefully hammer home the point of decentralization a little bit more. So this is the story of the gardener. So you have somebody who has a passion, has a green thumb. They think they have a green thumb. They're like, oh, I have like all sorts of plants. They have tons of varieties of plants. And, first they start watering them, and eventually they see that because they lack perfect information, they don't know what every plant needs. Some plants are doing better than others. And then over time, they start like categorizing things, but maybe it doesn't actually fit the natural categories, but they're doing the best they can. And like, hopefully their garden is turning out okay. They're buying more nutrients and they're like tending to these ones. These ones have been oppressed for a long time, so they like tend to these ones. I'm sure you're starting to see the picture that we're the garden and the government is the gardener. So over time, you're just like, this isn't working. Like, what is going on here? And you turn to your right and you see the forest. And you're like, the forest doesn't have a gardener. Why is the forest doing so well? And the reason is the forest actually has the best gardener, which is the decentralized information processing system at the base layer, which is the mycelial networks, which help distribute the nutrients, help create chemicals. They're the chemical factories that help the entire ecosystem thrive. And without the mushroom, the forest wouldn't be there, or it wouldn't be as pretty as it is. And so, you know, you can stick to your guns and be like, oh, no, but I want to be a gardener. I can do better than the forest, but you're never going to be able to do as good as the forest does. And that's the thing is we can create our own central bank digital currencies and be like, we're better. And like, oh, there's going to be a new coin that's better than Bitcoin. But the point is, it's not about the speed of the transactions or anything. It's about the decentralization. It's about the fact that it was founded fairly. The creator's gone. Nobody knows where he went or who he was or anything. It's just a completely like a gift given, like a Deus ex machina. You know, it's just like a hand of God. It's just like, here you go, do with it what you will. It's the same thing with like psilocybin mushrooms. Like, here you go. Like, and well, looks like we did pretty well with them. Like, it seems like it's transformed people's lives. So let's give Bitcoin a chance and see what we can do with it. Because I mean, it seems like, you know, the cocaine addiction is getting out of hand, and I don't know if we have any other option. So anyways, I think that's it for my talk, and I welcome you guys to ask any questions.
Thank you. I'm going to be completely ignorant about this. I didn't have time to investigate much on Earth, and this really isn't just how you get more. So I know I'm starting to see all these advertisements for these like Visa cards, Bitcoin, and you know, buy today.
Mm-hmm.
So what's sort of the normal route, I guess, for the next step?
Okay, so she's asking what's the best onboarding ramp to get into cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in particular. So there's a number of different ones, but what you want to look for is the ones with the lowest fees. That's the most important thing, right? Because a lot of these, they might not have fees up front, but they have large spreads. So you're like buying Bitcoin, but it's actually 3% higher than the real price. So what I would recommend is, I mean, there's either Newton, that's one of them, crypto.com. That's a very, you guys are probably going to remember that, crypto.com. I mean, that's easy. Anybody can, you don't even have to write that down. But there's going to be a number of different on-ramps. I mean, there's even bullbitcoin.ca. It's a Canada-based company that deals exclusively in Bitcoin. And so, yeah, there's a number of different on-ramps, and some of those have their own Visa cards that you can use. I personally would recommend using most of your Bitcoin as just a store of value. So a lot of people recommend anywhere between 1% to 5% of your savings as Bitcoin. And over time, you know, if this actually takes off, that 1% to 5% will turn into 100 to 500% of your current net worth. So that was what I would recommend. Hopefully that answers your question.
We do have a chat room separately just for crypto in the Discord to talk more about it on these kind of things. But you have to be on the mushrooms to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe you answered this question. Let's say for an argument that this becomes widespread. What's the goal of taking it centralized?
So the thing about, for example, the Bitcoin monetary network. Oh yeah, sorry. So if crypto becomes mainstream, what prevents it from being centralized? So I have sort of a twofold answer to this. On one hand, the Bitcoin monetary network itself is more or less not possible to centralize, because there's always, it's like a free market. There's always opportunity for you to set up your own mining operation. Now, if you had a large amount of wealth, the thing is you'd have to invest a huge amount of money into creating your own operation to centralize it. And because it's not like it's free. It not only costs the upfront cost of the computational power, but also the ongoing costs of electricity. So there was fears about, for example, China doing this. But fortunately, in a way, proving the sort of resilience of and the anti-fragility of the Bitcoin network, there was a little bit of an attack on it, and China is like banning it and shutting stuff down. But then what that does is actually helps decentralize the Bitcoin network even more, because then that just gives opportunity for people all around the world. For example, El Salvador is using geothermal volcanic energy. The president was like proudly taking drone footage showing that, you know, they have that starting to set up. So on that hand, that's the one idea. Now the second one, where you're saying the sort of the popularity of cryptocurrency increases, and there's all these other thousands of dog coins out there, and you know, Cardano and all these other tokens that have like all this technology and like interoperability and all these fancy words and, you know, fast transactions and more green and proof of stake. But the thing is that all of these other options are essentially created by a creator that is still involved in the project and is incentivized to essentially pump his bags. You know what I mean? So like the company, whoever it is now gonna have a majority stake in the creation of this new currency. And then there's always gonna be insider information that allows for sort of like an unfair launch. So every other token that currently exists has as much as there are what's called whales, just like in the real world, like there's like the 0.01% that owns like a tremendous amount of the wealth. That's always going to be the case. Like there's never going to be a sort of communist currency where everybody has an equal share. But the thing is that when you compare all cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin has the most evenly distributed wallet distribution. So like because it's existed for the longest amount of time. There's been enough cycles for people who got in early to find their moon. So they find oh, I can pay off my mortgage. Oh, I can. So they sell and then they redistribute to even more wallet holders. So like, because it's been through the most cycles, it actually ends up being the most decentralized due to its network effect. Yeah, thanks for the question. Here, in the back there. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what value, how's it different than like money or like stock or something?
Okay, so he's asking what causes the value of Bitcoin to increase or decrease, and how is that different from a stock, for example? And so, in a sense, it's actually not different than a stock. Like it is an asset class, and the more money that flows into it, the more that the value increases. But the difference is that it has a fixed set of tokens or a fixed inflation rate, because currently there's still Bitcoin that are being mined. They're about 900 per day, or exactly 900 per day. And but the thing is that you can think of currently like if we compare the current monetary system and the Bitcoin network, when we think of inflation, you can think of a balloon, right? And gas is what fills that balloon, right? And as the gas fills the balloon, it inflates. But everybody's portion on that balloon becomes smaller. The difference between that is because the money supply is increasing, everybody's value is decreasing. Whereas Bitcoin is kind of like a condensed, it's like a thermodynamically closed loop system. So it's like you can take the gas that is causing inflation and you can compress it in Bitcoin. And because there's no more Bitcoin being created, or it's at a very slow rate comparatively to the total supply already, it actually, you take the value and you sort of dissolve it into the Bitcoin network. And then as people take it out, so if there's more sellers and they're selling it back for dirty fiat money, then the Bitcoin price will go down. And as it's still in its infancy, there's definitely, I'm not going to paint a pretty picture here. There's definitely still a tremendous amount of market manipulation that goes on in the cryptocurrency space. So that's something that you have to. That's why there's like the spiritual believers in this. There's this sort of buy and hold mentality where you just you kind of disconnect from the volatility of the market, and you just know that over time number go up. So yeah. Here, I'll Anna.
You mentioned the adopted ideology, and people are incentivized to provide values as opposed to extract value. So what kind of society do you see with that cycle?
Okay, so she's asking, with Bitcoin, we're essentially, if we're incentivized to add value instead of extract value, what type of society could we potentially see as a result of that? And I think the answer is kind of simple. So the idea here would be, currently, like we've had a tremendous amount of progress in today's society, right? Like we have supercomputers in our pockets. You know, I basically on my wrist I have one. Like it's incredible what we've been able to do. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that are going up in price. For example, the cost of milk and bread and all this sort of stuff. And you'd think as society becomes better and goods become cheaper to produce, that the price of things would come down. So what if we were to adopt Bitcoin and essentially have a deflationary currency, then we would be able to continue our mission of using technology to allow for prices to become zero. So like we would bring prices down as an asymptote. Like technology over time, as it continues to improve, things would get cheaper and cheaper. And as a result of things getting cheaper and cheaper, life would get better because people would have more time and more opportunity to kind of take a break and not have to work 40 hours a week, you know? And so the kind of society that we would see would be essentially one where people have more time. They have more time to do the things that they enjoy. And because they essentially, the money that they have is more valuable, not only because of the fact that as they hold on to their savings accounts, those appreciate in price as the world adds more value into its own system, but also because the world will be incentivized to add value and not extract value. So everything around them, not only does their money go stronger, but everything around them will get cheaper. So, you know, that's the kind of world that we would see over time. Because right now, unfortunately, things getting cheaper right now are a result of people exploiting others. So for example, let's export labor to China or other third world countries, not because, see, they use a different currency that's weaker. So we can actually take advantage of that. But if everybody had the same currency, you can't actually use this exploitation as an excuse of you actually have to come up with real solutions on how to make things cheaper. So you would have a world of less exploitation and less financed wars and more peace, essentially. Yeah.
So my understanding is
That's a great question. So basically, if crypto became more widespread, what would we do with things like taxation? So this is something where I don't have the complete answer to. This is something that is very open to speculation. But a lot of people in the crypto space suggest that when we take a psychedelic drug, you know, it's not like our ego dissolves forever. You know, it momentarily kind of gets redistributed to other layers of your brain, and you kind of have different areas communicating with each other and coming to all these new conclusions and insights, and hopefully you integrate some of that into your life as a result. And you become a new person, hopefully, right? If that's what you wanted. And so if crypto became more widespread, you know, it's the same idea of like, okay, if psychedelics became more widespread, what kind of world can we expect? And essentially, it's not that the ego wouldn't exist. So it's not that governments wouldn't exist, but the governments would have they'd be much more localized and have they'd be smaller government. And we would see something more akin, and I know this probably might be, you know, this needs a whole talk to unpack, but we'd have something more akin to anarcho-capitalism. So anarchy doesn't mean that there's no rules, it means that there's no rulers. So there would still be rules, but there just would be no rulers. So something like a technocratic society where, you know, we'd have technological base layers that that provided abundance for human beings, and basically taxation would be a thing of the past. And like everything would just be, the cost would be built into the goods and services that are available. Yeah.
more decentralized approach was used in terms of fully token, so to speak, there would be a more equitable distribution.
So there's something called the Pareto principle. Oh, yeah. Can you ask the question? Can you ask the question in like a sentence or two, and then I can repeat it, just because I want to make sure I can condense it.
I guess the nutshell of my question is, if Bitcoin is more decentralized and thus less susceptible to inflation, does that also mean the inequity in distribution of wealth will be positively affected?
Okay, so if the question was, if Bitcoin is adopted as the base layer and it is a decentralized currency, does that result in sort of a more equal distribution of wealth? And yeah, like a propensity towards the more equal distribution of wealth. So I would say that there is one law built into nature, it seems, which is something called the Pareto principle. So this idea of like there always is built in like this sort of unequal distribution. And so I think that there's no real way around that. Like there's always going to be people who either got in early and held or provide more value. But like one of the things, sort of the things built into the system that allows the redistribution to occur is as we transition to this new type of store of value, in the transitionary period, there's going to be sort of amounts, like opportunities for wealth generation from selling your Bitcoin that are incredibly enticing to a lot of people. And so that is like a built-in sort of effect that allows the redistribution of tokens. So over time, more and more people will have some Bitcoin, but I don't think we're ever going to reach a point, just like with the current monetary system, where there's going to be sort of like a more fair distribution. Like I think that the one difference would be that maybe it would be a little bit more fair just because of there's no centralized ability to print more for yourself, right? Like right now, you central banking technically just like print it and then give it to their banker friends and like bail them out first and like bail out these big companies. Whereas in this case, there's no like sort of hacks that you can use. You know, you essentially, you can, you know, build this big mining operation, which has this huge upfront cost, and then it's this huge ongoing cost of electricity. And that's, you know, you're going to make money, but it's not like this get rich quick scheme, for example. So I think it might be over time, it's probably a little bit better in terms of even distribution, but it's not going to be perfect. Yeah.
Speaking on the last questions about taxation, anarcho-capitalists, and fair wealth distribution, don't you think it's a lot more realistic
Okay, so I'll just repeat the very end. So basically, isn't it a little bit of a reach to believe that the world will adopt Bitcoin as the mainstream currency as opposed to central governments sort of using that as a way to accelerate their creation of their own type of tokens that then they will just quickly kind of come in and replace Bitcoin as the competitor? And like in a way that seems like obviously more realistic. And I wouldn't be able to guarantee that that's not what's going to be the case. But there's a great sort of Bitcoin prophet, comedian, crazy guy that I would want to quote here, which is his name is Max Kaiser. And basically, fiat currency, Bitcoin has no top because fiat currency has no bottom. And so what that means is like over time right now, because we've eliminated the gold standard, it's kind of untethered the economic reality. And what we're faced with is sort of a whirlwind of economic uncertainty and destruction as a result of it. And so it almost feels like you can think of Bitcoin as like Noah's Ark. And right now, if you were to buy some Bitcoin, it's like a ticket to the Ark for surviving the oncoming flood. And the flood would be liquidity, right? And the liquidity is hid behind all these asset classes like the stock market. And like, you know, you've seen with the meme stocks, like, let's get GameStop and AMC, and like we're pumping it up and everything. And then it's like you're extracting all this wealth that was previously hidden behind this walled garden. And as more and more of this money flows in to the hands of normal people, we have more and more inflation. And so this inflation is something that will eventually, there needs to be something to solve this inflation. And the problem is if the governments around the world were to just come in, step in, what they're actually coming in, it's like they're actually trying to fight against the religion, right? Like Bitcoin, people now, like just like people are willing to die for the American dollar, like people are now starting to be willing to like, they're putting their countries in the face of all this, all these opposition for Bitcoin. And so people are willing to kind of die for Bitcoin. And the thing is, you can't just like come out of nowhere and be like, oh, well, you know, we caused this problem, but we have the solution, which is really just a rebranding of the thing that caused the problem. Whereas Bitcoin would be like, oh, like, well, this doesn't have an owner. Like, I don't know. I'm starting to lose trust in the government itself. Like, they haven't really, you know, handled this COVID crisis that great. Like, they did their best job or whatever. Like, but like, they didn't really do a great job. And like, so I think more and more the there's a growing distrust in central governments, and in like the human body is starting to question whether its ego is really out for its best interest, or if the ego is really using fear to maintain what it identifies with, i.e. itself. So as people start waking up to the governments around the world, just being up to the same old bullshit, then them coming out with this solution just seems a bit suspect when you've already have something that works. Why not just use that? So that's what I would think.
Thank you, Peter.
Can we ask